Hello, today is Wednesday, April 1st. Happy April Fool's Day, team. This is no joke. The entire OG podcast crew is here together just for you on this great holiday. We're at episode 577 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI Senior Fellow Jessica Jones, and I'm joined today by our favorites, Executive Director Jamil Jaffer, Advisory Board Member Les Munson, and Senior Fellow Morgan Vina. Happy April Fool's Day, team. All right, today we're talking about the Iran conflict, but from a different lens. We're talking about the global energy map. The war with Iran has disrupted, global oil supplies with the Strait of Hormuz shut down. It's driven prices up. It's forced countries to scramble for alternatives. And in that scramble, Russia has become basically the fallback supplier. Many Asian nations from the Philippines to Vietnam are now competing for Russian crude as energy shortages deepen. Of course, we know that China and India have been longtime purchasers of Russian oil as well. At the same time, the U.S. has temporarily eased sanctions on some Russian shipments to help stabilize global supply. And we've seen Russia's oil revenue just surge in the early weeks of the conflict. TBD on how long that surge is going to last, but it's definitely been a financial lifeline as to help sustain its war effort in Ukraine. And then another, throw in another Russian oil story. Just earlier this week, a Russian oil tanker arrived in Cuba. The White House signaled it would not block the shipment. So I guess the blockade is done. Delivered about 100,000 tons of crude to the island. As we've discussed here on the show, Cuba has been kind of a bit of a humanitarian crisis. They've been struggling lack of electricity across the island, and has been under, the White House's thumb, feeling the pressure from the Trump administration for the last few weeks. Okay, so a lot to talk about here. Morgan, I'm going to turn first to you. How does this, I'll put it in air quotes, maybe temporary windfall for Russia play out in terms of its, economic positioning, in terms of its positioning in its war with Iran, war in Ukraine? Like, how does this play into that?
So, Jess, I think this episode really does build off nicely from Monday's episode when we talked about Russia's position in the conflicts, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine. Russia is definitely having some short-term wins, maybe long-term wins here when it comes to their oil sales. President Trump, of course, lifted restrictions on the purchase of Russian oil. India and China are the main beneficiaries. They were able to lock in pretty early before some of our small Asian partners, namely like the Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand, and others. And so I think the big question I have here is, how long is this going to last? And is it indeed a temporary lifting of restrictions, or is it more permanent? And then, of course, what are the conditions under which we either allow these restrictions to be lifted, or under what circumstances do we put the restrictions back on Russia? And I think these are still very much to be determined. It is no surprise, I'm stating the obvious here, that Iran would close, or at least try to close, the Straits of Hormuz should they be attacked. It is their main point of leverage right now. We saw Iran threaten to close the strait after the EU put sanctions on Iran in 2012. I think at least Jamil and Lester remember the 80s and the tanker wars there, and what
less questions that he's like, I do not.
The 1980s, those ones, yeah,
those be the ones, Les. And so, of course, that's their main point of leverage. And my question for the administration is, what was the planning that was going into mitigating this oil crisis? Obviously, we've seen gas prices, hit levels that, frankly, I haven't seen before. And so whether or not this is going to be a temporary measure, and that is, of course, when I'm referring to temporary measures, restriction or lifting the restrictions on Russia, is again, I think, a big question mark that we all have. And not only that, but if these restrictions are continuing to be lifted, that obviously is a boon to the Russian economy and its leverage, particularly in international conflicts.
Hey, Jamil, what do you make of the easing of the sanctions? Is it temporary? We also saw the President Trump yesterday talking about NATO, making some comments about reconsidering withdrawal. Comments also coming from the Secretary of Defense. Is Russia having just a really great week?
Yeah, well, just obviously, the president's comments, which he's made, at times before about leaving NATO, are not helpful, and definitely are a gain for Russia. If the NATO alliance were to collapse, which it is not going to, and the president has talked about it over and over again, he's almost certainly not going to leave the NATO alliance. I think he's continuing to put pressure on our allies to do more, to put more money and more resources into the alliance, to step up and actually, frankly, get more engaged on the Straits of Hormuz, which is what he's really frustrated about right now. So I do think that writ large, every time you talk about the NATO alliance and suggest the U.S. might not be there, that is a win for Russia and for its effort to rebuild essentially the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which is really at the core of Vladimir Putin's theory of the world. I also think that this easing of sanctions on Russia, to Morgan's point, it's not clear that the easing will ever stop, and it's also hugely problematic. Russia is the number 3 producer of oil in the world. They have benefited from our adversaries buying their oil, like Iran, like China, for example. Now, our allies as well, India, which is a good partner of the United States in the Quad, has been buying oil from Russia. But let's be honest, one of the biggest purchasers is China, and China is a clear adversary of the United States. Remember, President Trump is trying to put pressure on Russia to end the conflict in Ukraine. He's been trying to do that for the better part of a year now. He's been trying to put pressure on China to do a better trade deal with the United States. He's trying to put pressure on Iran to end the conflict and to give in to the U.S.'s demands with respect to its nuclear program, its missile program, and the like. And of course, easing up pressure on Russia doesn't help any of that. It may reduce in a limited sense the world price of oil temporarily, but it's a win for China. It's a win for Russia. And of course, Russia is a big supporter of Iran, supplying intelligence and drones to Iran to attack American military members. And so it's crazy to ease up pressure on a country that's literally targeting Americans right now and on whom you want to increase pressure. It makes no sense. It's a terrible idea, and probably one of the most problematic foreign policies of the administration right now today.
So, Jess, I just want to build on something Jamil said, particularly on NATO. The Trump administration is particularly salty with the Europeans for not doing more in Ukraine, for relying on the United States. That's fair, and so the administration feels that the Europeans need to come to our aid in support of our war on Iran, and I think that's fair to a certain extent. However, there needed to be a certain level of planning and coordination involved ahead of these strikes on Iran, looping our European partners in and making very clear what those expectations of them are going into this war, I think would have set us up for success, particularly as we're looking at this energy crisis. The Europeans clearly have a lot to lose here as well. They are begrudgingly allowing us to, use their airspace, use their bases. This coordination could have been better, and I don't think this war has done anything to improve relations. If anything, it has poured salt in the wounds, which are already there, and really just sort of exposed these fundamental weaknesses with the alliance.
I love you say coordination could have been better or could have been at all. It might have been a question.
Right.
And I already see Les's comments of Europe needs to put its big boy pants on it and get over it. Just join in. So Les, on this April Fools of 2026, what wisdom can you impart? Maybe lessons from the 80s that you can share with our listeners.
Yeah, I can't. Yes, I lived through the 80s. I went to high school and college in the 80s, but I'm so old I can't remember what happened then.
You are old.
No lessons learned.
Look, I do. I think we're hyperventilating a little bit here over the easing of Iran of the sanctions on Russia. It's in all likelihood a temporary measure to help us prevail over Iran. In the long run, which is like the next 2 months, if we're able to achieve what we want in Iran, and the price was a temporary few days lifting of sanctions on Russia, great A+ win for the administration, in my opinion. Now, if if our hyperventilating is appropriate and these lifting of sanctions is permanent, shame on the Trump administration. That's a horrible idea. And I'm all for admonishing the Europeans for being a bunch of wusses, but they have been terrible on Iran for decades. This is not new. It's not because Donald Trump has temper tantrums and is inappropriately rude and says kind of dumb stuff about Greenland and all that kind of thing. Yes, that's an issue, but the root cause here is Europe has been wrong on Iran going back to when we were all working on the JCPOA, and Europe was all in on that, even though all of the nation states in the Middle East actually thought it was a horrible idea, the Sunni Arab states and Israel. That dynamic maintains today. The people who are supporting the U.S. effort against Iran are Israel and the Sunni Arab states in the Middle East. Europe doesn't like it. They've never liked it. They don't want to take a hard line on Iran. Shame on them. If they want the alliance with the United States to mean something, and they should, then they need to reconsider their decisions with respect to Iran. Yes, it's not technically part of NATO. Nevertheless, the alliance between us and our European friends is critically important, and they ought to be leaning way closer to us. The Trump administration is not wrong on that.
So
not technically part of NATO. It'd be a really big NATO bloc if it was.
I can't believe I'm going to say this. I actually agree with almost everything Les just said.
Oh,
but one exception, of course,
through line in Europe wrong on Iran.
Yeah, but he's right. I mean, it's inarguably right. I think where he's wrong is this temporary relieving of sanctions on Russia, because the truth is we have a lot of other levers we could pull. We could release more barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We could work with our OPEC, former OPEC allies to put more oil on the market. There's a lot of things we could do before we relieve sanctions on on Russia. And that's why it seems to me that's a terrible idea. There's a lot of other levers to pull. This is not the one to pull. But other than that, I think Les is totally right, which I've never said before in my life.
That is not true, Jamil. You have said I was right plenty of times.
Yeah, only because
recorded and written on his wall.
Because I was going to fire you if you didn't.
Do you have a list somewhere in a document where you could go back to?
I should write that down.
It's a journal.
Write that down.
There you go.
All right. Thanks so much. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks so much to Crowley, Grace Trice, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI team for their help in producing today's episode. Join us on Friday, April 3rd for another great episode of Fault Lines, NSI's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. We're on YouTube. Check out our channel for a video of today's episode. And if you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.